This bear was drugged and used as a test pilot to experiment with the ejector seats of the B-58 Hustler, a Mach 2 jet created by the US in the 1950s. The purpose of the jet was to deliver nuclear weapons to the Soviet Union. You see, at this period in time, the US and the Soviet Union were locked in a silent war called the Cold War, and both superpowers were keen to step up the game to gain an advantage over the others. Unfortunately, the war included unwilling participants, and this bear was one of the victims who got caught up in the fight between the superpowers. But this bear wasn't the only one who was used. Unemployed people and chimps were also used for the ejector seats. While none of the bears died, some were injured before the program was discontinued. The use of bears to test the jet and bomb showed the desperation and absurdity of both superpowers to gain an edge in the Cold War. This included espionage and all the absurd activities of the secret world, displaying how far both nations were willing to go to get ahead of the war. When you hear the word espionage, you're most likely to imagine a spy like James Bond, and for the most part, they are human. But the intelligence agencies do not discriminate, and like what you've seen, they do not shy away from using animals, and this is why Operation Acoustic Kitty existed. During the 1960s, the CIA noticed that cats often wandered in and out of confidential meetings of an Asian head of state without being suspected as a spy. So, the CIA trained and surgically planted microphones and transmitters into cats to send them and listen in on the conversation of targets. The operation, however, didn't end up working. One former officer claimed that the first cat was run over when they first deployed it, but others disputed this. The only official document is heavily redacted, and it suggested that the operation was abandoned. However, the cats were probably trained and deployed. They were also not shy about working with children. In 1945, the Soviet Union's security agency, the KGB, planted a listening device in the US Embassy in Moscow. Their secret mission was executed by none other than their precious secret agents, the Soviet schoolchildren. They hand-delivered a wooden US Great Seal to the US ambassador. The seal sat in the room for 7 years in the ambassador's study before the US intelligence officer discovered it in 1952. During the Cold War, you have to be careful of anyone bearing gifts, even school children. During the 1960s, the US started Project Iceworm to build a nuclear missile launch site under the ice sheet in Greenland, close enough to hit the Soviet Union with medium-range missiles. They planned to bore a 4,023-kilometer long tunnel underneath the ice. However, the project proved to be difficult due to the slow and constant movement of the ice. Eventually, the project was abandoned in 1966. Now, after decades, the warming climate exposed the project's toxic past and the threat it has to the environment if the ice keeps thawing. In 1954, British and American spies had an idea to build a tunnel under West Berlin called Operation Gold so they could install wiretaps and listen in to the Soviet HQ communication with East Germany. However, before the construction even began, Moscow already knew about it thanks to the British trader George Blake. The Soviets, anxious to protect Blake, allowed the operation to begin, even to the extent of information breach, until 1956 when the Soviets accidentally discovered the tunnel. At that point, it was already more than 400 meters long. The CIA said the intelligence collected during the time more than justified the operation. Both sides claimed victory. In the world of espionage, communication lies at the heart of operations, but communicating is dangerous, so spies need to do it secretly. They have to communicate about future meetings, danger signals, and instructions on the mission. The CIA used animal carcasses like dead pigeons and rats that were gutted to put secret spy gears inside their cavity. Imagination is the limit when devising effective hiding places. During World War II, microdots, a text or an image reduced in size to around 1 millimeter in diameter, were used by the Germans to communicate with agents. Agents hid them on a finger or under a toenail, in jewelry, or inside book bindings. They also used invisible inks, like the ones used by Josephine Baker, who used musical sheets to inform the French military about military strategies and troop movements of the Axis powers. However, one of the most absurd and unbelievable stories about espionage and deception is Operation Mincemeat. During World War II, the Allies wanted to convince the Germans that the invasion of southern Europe would happen in Sardinia instead of Sicily. Sounds simple, but the length they were willing to go to do this was so ridiculous it's hard to believe it happened. The idea came from the British intelligence operatives. They dressed up a corpse, yes, a real dead body, as a Royal Marines officer. Then, they created false documents to plant on the body, suggesting that the Allies were going to invade Sardinia instead of Sicily, where the real event would take place. The body then was dropped off the neutral Spanish coast to look like a victim of an air crash, and the Germans found the documents on the body. They believed the documents to be real, and they brought them to Adolf Hitler himself. The plan was a success, and it contributed to the Allied victory. To make it convincing, they created a complete life history of the man. The man, identified as Glinder Michael, was a former homeless Welshman who committed suicide before being taken and given a new identity, William Martin. Now, the body rests in Spain with full military honors. William Martin, the man who never was, who existed in the necessity of the secret world, is a testament to its absurdity. Now, the activity of espionage has relatively slowed down compared to the Cold War era. However, it is still practiced. The US still train ravens and pigeons, and Putin's Russia use dolphins and whales for surveillance. Other methods include computers to find relevant intelligence information, spy satellites and aircraft that send advanced aerial photography, and seismographs that can detect nuclear testing. There are only so many ways to distinguish between friends and foes, and espionage will continue to exist with no real end in sight. Most countries in the world have at one time or another spied on other countries, other groups, or their own citizens. Countries spy to achieve their own national security goals, especially when they think their security is threatened, like having a crazy dictator trying to destroy everything. But they also do it because they recognize its importance. Spying deals with information and knowledge can be powerful. Sure, sometimes the knowledge is useless, but at other times, it is enough to blackmail someone, influence how a battle ends, sway a government, or even change the fate of the world. During World War II, the US broke the Japanese cipher before the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, but only managed to read the diplomatic ciphers, not the military communications, leading to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The British were luckier. They broke the German cipher, enabling them to know what was happening in German-occupied nation. As a result, they knew which cities would be bombed before the actual raids and the location of the U-boat, shortening the war by several years, saving countless lives, and helping to determine the outcome of the conflict. During the Cold War, espionage was thought to be important because it helped to prevent the Cold War from becoming too hot. Without espionage, there could have been a major war happening between the US and the Soviet Union. The US and the Soviet Union differed in many ways, mainly in ideology, which was the main cause of the Cold War. However, despite all of their differences, they held a common belief, the existence of superhumans. They believed in people who could slow down time, change their body shape, levitate, see into the future, and more. Both nations thought that these powers would help them win the war. So shamans, yogis, and psychics were sought from the west coast of America to the far corners of the Soviet Union. Millions were spent to create a real-life Superman or Wonder Woman. When the American military and the CIA heard reports of Soviet experiments, they felt forced to start their own. In Project Jedi, soldiers were taught invisibility, seeing into the future, and extraordinary intuition like knowing how many chairs are in a room before walking in and stopping the hearts of animals. In 1975, the Chicago Tribune reported that the CIA found a man who could see what was happening anywhere in the world. They were Russell Targ and Uri Geller. At Stanford Research Institute, they would sit, close their eyes, and draw the location of Soviet missiles. Sometimes, they were right. However, compared to the Soviets, this experiment seemed harmless. In Special Department 8, located in southwest Siberia, Soviet scientists were trying to prove the existence of extrasensory perception. In one creepy experiment, they implanted electrodes in a mother rabbit's brain and took her babies off to a submarine. When it was deep enough below the surface, they killed the baby one by one. At each synchronized time of death, the mother's brain reacted. Unsurprisingly, some experiments made experts feel uncomfortable, and one lab was even shut down in 1974 due to the resident scientists rejecting en masse on what they called negative work. It's also widely believed that in a sub basement below Filatov Institute in Odessa, they were experimenting with death row prisoners and animals by blasting them with pulsing magnetic fields to see if they would become clairvoyant. In 1991, they claimed that their animals could see through walls. Sadly, their small animal brains can't cope with the onslaught of magnetic fields and simply disintegrate. The prisoners were reported to suffer the same horrible fate. All the absurdities raise one question: is this all morally justified? Well, spying is commonly seen as inherently immoral, but according to the Dirty Hands approach, spying is a necessary evil, and it is required to protect national security. So certain immoral acts can be seen as moral in the context of espionage. Another method is to adopt a rights-based approach, like the one Cécile Fabre proposed, that states have moral permission to spy to protect individual rights. This permission is tied to certain conditions. Espionage must be necessary to protect against the violation of fundamental rights, and there should be public evidence that such violations are imminent. Spies are only morally justified if they prevent the anticipated rights violation and cause more good than harm. This is where the US failed. In 2003, the US invaded Iraq on the basis that Saddam Hussein's regime was manufacturing weapons of mass destruction. However, weapon inspectors had been on the ground in Iraq for 3 months and they found no evidence of smoking guns that could be a trigger for war. And yet, senior figures of the Bush administration continued to assert the weapons of mass destruction narrative. Colin Powell, US Secretary of State, even justified this based on the intelligence they gathered, which they insisted were facts. However, the US and the UK were wrong about Iraq's weapon programs, and the fact that they were wrong should be taken into consideration. To prevent this, the UN Security Council should be able to stop a country from acting with incomplete information. Any allegations should be assessed independently based on their veracity and accuracy of the actual thing. When we look at the different assessments of 3 countries about Iraq's capacity for destruction, Australia was closer to the facts due to its more cautious approach despite having limited material than that available to the US and the UK. Despite there being clear resistance to the creation of international organizations that gather and analyze evidence, states still use such evidence to justify preemptive strikes. The way the international law treats espionage also makes for an interesting case. The law for espionage during wartime and peacetime is different. During an armed conflict, spies lose their rights as prisoners of war status, like protections around accommodation and access to food, clothing, hygiene, and medical care. However, members of the armed forces who wear their uniforms instead of civilian attire can gather information without losing prisoner of war status. Also, a spy who rejoins their armed forces and is then captured bears no responsibility for previous acts of espionage. If captured, they may not face execution and are guaranteed the right to a fair trial. It's pretty weird. For the law during peacetime, some government officials and scholars believe that nothing in international law prohibits spying, so states can spy on each other without restrictions. But some scholars disagree, saying that international law contains an affirmative right to spy on the basis that spying is necessary for self-defense, suggesting that prohibiting spying would restrict the right to self-defense. However, some methods may be illegal and violate international law, while others are allowed, like satellite spying, based on the principle that space is the province of mankind. Still, states allow foreign spies in their countries if they want their spies to operate abroad. When the UK expelled Russian state actors, Russia retaliated by expelling numerous British agents in response. So, to avoid political unknowns, most governments don't want to expel foreign spies for fear of retaliation. Espionage is absurd, and it's not as romantic and thrilling as a James Bond movie. It's slow, tedious, and sometimes painful. Operations fail, gadgets don't work, and there's no license to kill. In many ways, it forces people to live an abnormal life, a fake life with fake relationships and a fake self. It forces fully functioning adults to do absolutely ridiculous things. However, all the absurdities are necessitated by another form of absurdity, human irrationality and stupidity. We fight over land and ideologies instead of trying to find a way to live peacefully together. We fail to trust one another and believe that humans will take advantage of other humans. However, no matter how absurd the nature of espionage is, it is needed to keep us safe, and it can also be used for peace. Conflict is expensive, and states rationally avoid it. So intelligence agencies can help by making critical information available to policymakers and diplomats on all sides. States can also reduce the risk of war by revealing information that reduces misunderstandings. However, that's not to say that intelligence will always lead to peace, because it's neither a force for peace nor war. It depends on how we use it. But it might help states compete with each other and act as a release valve. The battle of information, after all, is always better than actual battles.